Subscribe to the Survival Record if you value the kind of history that doesn't just recount what happened, but explains how people actually endured it. Most people assume that warmth in wartime came down to logistics, fuel deliveries, field stoves, or the luck of being quartered indoors. That assumption misses a quieter reality of the Second World War. Across Europe and Asia, millions of soldiers, prisoners, and civilians survived winters with no access to fuel at all. Not because they were tougher by nature, but because they adapted, often in ways that were undocumented, unofficial, and later ignored because they didn't fit clean narratives of industrial warfare. These heating methods didn't rely on firewood, coal, or gasoline. They relied on physics, biology, architecture, and discipline. And while they rarely appear in after-action reports, they shaped survival outcomes just as decisively as rations or ammunition. Before we talk about technology, we need to understand how cold became a strategic enemy. By late 1941, cold had stopped being just a seasonal inconvenience and had really become an operational threat. German forces outside Moscow, well, they actually lost more men to exposure and frostbite than to Soviet fire during certain periods. In Finland, Italy, Manchuria, and the Balkans, armies discovered that heating failures, translated directly into combat ineffectiveness. Many of these methods were improvised locally, passed along orally, and never really standardized. One reason they kind of faded from post-war memory. The first solution was learning how to turn the human body into a stable heat system rather than just a heat source. One of the least glamorous but, most effective heating strategies was controlled stillness. German, Soviet, and Japanese field manuals eventually acknowledged what frontline units learned the hard way. Movement without enough calories actually accelerated heat loss. Soldiers in extreme cold were instructed to minimize unnecessary motion even during sentry duty and, rotate positions to prevent heat depletion. This actually ran counter to earlier doctrines that equated activity with morale. The insight here was physiological rather than moral. Shivering is not a heating strategy, it's really a failure state. By conserving body heat through posture, layered compression, and reduced exposure, troops could, remain functional longer without any external heat source. Post-war cold weather doctrine, especially in NATO alpine units, directly incorporated these lessons. Shelter orientation actually mattered more than insulation, especially in situations where nothing could be burned. In places like occupied Eastern Europe and northern China, civilians ended up adapting abandoned structures into heat-conserving shelters. They did this by altering the orientation of the buildings, rather than changing the materials themselves. The key insight here was really about convection control. Heat loss was reduced, not by adding more warmth, but by preventing that warmth from escaping in the first place. It's interesting because modern survival manuals often overlook this, focusing instead on insulation-heavy solutions that just assume you'll have access to plenty of materials. One of the most persistent myths of cold survival is that thicker clothing equals better warmth. But actually, the Second World War demonstrated quite the opposite. German and Soviet troops both learned, often the hard way, that sweat accumulation was lethal in freezing conditions. Soldiers stripped layers before exertion, even in sub-zero temperatures, and then reapplied them immediately after. In Leningrad, civilians surviving the siege used paper, rags, and even bark as vapor barriers inside clothing, not to insulate but to keep sweat from soaking outer layers. The lesson was clear: dryness preserves heat better than bulk. Shared body heat was systematized, not improvised, in extreme environments. Soviet partisan units and prisoner-of-war groups in both German and Japanese camps rotated sleeping arrangements to ensure no one remained cold-soaked for extended periods. The effectiveness lay in predictability. Heat sharing only worked when it was planned, limited, and enforced. Post-war survival psychology studies later confirmed that structured discomfort is more tolerable and more survivable than chaotic exposure. In multiple theaters, underground living was less about concealment than temperature control. Soil maintains a relatively stable temperature even in extreme cold. Soviet civilians, partisans, and frontline troops expanded dugouts deeper not for protection, but for warmth. In Warsaw, resistance members modified cellars to reduce airflow and maintain livable temperatures without fuel. This method required labor rather than resources, making it accessible when supply lines collapsed. It reinforced a principle still taught in survival engineering: depth equals thermal stability. Without fuel, heating shifted inward. Troops learned to time calorie intake strategically, consuming fats and carbohydrates before rest periods to maximize metabolic heat during sleep. Soviet ration distribution adjusted accordingly in winter campaigns, prioritizing evening meals. Cold erodes decision-making before it kills. World War II accounts repeatedly show that units with strong internal routines, fixed schedules, enforced rest, shared responsibility, outperformed equally equipped units that lacked structure. What these forgotten methods reveal is not ingenuity, but adaptation under constraint. None of these heating hacks were elegant. They didn't involve clever gadgets or secret technology. They worked because they respected physical limits rather than denying them. But for those who lived through fuelless winters, survival depended on understanding heat as a system, not a resource. Remembering these stories matters because they challenge comfortable assumptions about preparedness. They remind us that when systems fail, knowledge outlasts equipment. These lessons, learned quietly in the margins of the largest war in history, still apply wherever cold, scarcity, and human endurance intersect. If you value this kind of grounded historical analysis, subscribe to the Survival Record. And if this episode added something to how you understand wartime survival, share it with someone who cares about history beyond the surface.